Israel did things before that. But nonetheless, the act of genocide, again, under UN law, is never justified, even if there is a provocation. The Nazis couldn't argue there was a provocation to genocide. You're saying that Israel can't. So why speak to only one side? And why pursue a restitution without trying to provide restitution for, in this sense, not that they're necessarily equal, but those who have suffered genocide, perhaps under your definition, on the Israeli side?
So, Jeremy, I want to point out to you that you already asked me that question. I had indicated that you asked that question, that I would answer one at a time. It's not that I wasn't going to answer that, but that you didn't let me continue. So thank you for re-articulating your question. I will answer that, but I'm not done answering the first one.
Oh, okay. I would love for you to get to the second one, but I think
I got you, but you asked me a lot, so I'm going to answer, and I promised you that I would.
Please,
There's no evasion here. I'm here to talk.
I don't think you're evading. Thank you.
Okay. So in answering the first question, I want to also continue. The Jewish experience in the Shoah has canonized genocide, but it is not the metric upon which we measure genocide. And even though it's nuclear to Jews, we have to understand that it has been experienced by so many peoples across this globe, including indigenous peoples on these lands that we settle, that the US hasn't recognized, including by Black Americans who brought a petition against the United States in 1951 in the We Charge Genocide at the Civil Rights Congress, including against the Hararo Nama people in Namibia, including against all the Africans who were kidnapped and then enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade, which is precisely why Martinican, right, poet and father of negritude, Amy Cesari, was so angry, right, with Europe to say, you have not recognized genocide in all of these instances until it happens within Europe's shores. Hitler was born in this colonial geography. So I want us to be expansive about what we're talking about. Jews are certainly victims of genocide, and frankly, the legacy of those survivors is showing us two forms. On the one hand, we have a legacy of those survivors who are saying never again means never again for anybody. On the other hand, we have survivors of that legacy who say, we are at such risk and such harm that we have to use all the force at our disposal for it not to happen again to us. So I just want to invite us to be expansive in this moment, to understand that even though Lemkin penned this in the context of the Third Reich's genocide, that it's not limited to that experience. And why I ended by saying, if you want to call it something else, go ahead, you can call it the Nakba, because that is the Palestinian experience of removal, of catastrophe, the trauma that we carry. Okay, let me answer the second question. Why am I not charging Hamas with genocide? Because again, here, let's focus on what we said. This is not about who the people are, but what they did. And is Hamas targeting Jews for being Jewish, or did they target those civilians illegally, illegitimately, in my opinion? And I know that this would put me at odds, probably with a lot of people, but I stick to this principle, right? Was not for the purpose to destroy a people in whole or in part, but from what is very clear from its own operations, and is being made more clear, is that this was a military operation intended in order to capture prisoners, captives of war, civilians illegally. And I'll get to this, civilians illegally. They shouldn't capture any of the civilians, and they actually offered to release them all within the first day. All the civilian hostages, Israel refused. It wanted revenge, right? And it wanted to end the siege. They were breaking through a militarized perimeter that was subjecting them to slow death. 17 years. They didn't come out of nowhere because they were driven by hate or they didn't like Jewish people. They were driven by a cause to end their siege, to release their prisoner, to change the conditions that were condemning them to slow death. Does that mean that Hamas's operations were legitimate? No. and they will be prosecuted. And they've agreed to be prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But it is not, in my opinion, it does not merit the call that this is genocidal. Otherwise, we would describe nearly all freedom struggles, all anti-colonial liberation struggles as genocidal, and we would have condemned all of those peoples to a lifetime of being colonized and servitude and oppression. So how do we get ourselves out of this? I've insisted that there's no military solution, not for Palestinians and not for Israelis. There's no military solution. There has to be a diplomatic solution. But I also insist that it doesn't, that this is why, in direct response to your question, I wouldn't describe what Hamas did as genocidal.
Yeah, I have trouble buying that, I'm sorry to say. And that doesn't justify Israel's behavior, nor does it say that one form of genocide justifies another. But Israelis would make many of the same defense arguments you make for Hamas. And just as you cite many Israelis, most of whom are not in government now, but some who have used genocidal language, I can cite much of genocidal language from Hamas, from its own charter of 1988. Even some of it is in the charter of 2017. So for me, where I'd like to go next, so we're not relitigating this, I think we've articulated our positions on this. From my point of view, it's hard to identify Israel's genocide without talking about Hamas's. You see them as different. But for us to then move the conversation forward, what would be the legitimate forms of defense by Israel? If, just taking your own language, right? And I will put my cards on the table. I also think Israel has misused force. I will put my cards on the table. I don't like the way the IDF and Netanyahu have responded to October 7th for all kinds of reasons. One of the reasons for me is that I think they've been excessive and, as you articulated, also ineffective. They've been excessive and ineffective. So I will stipulate that I agree to that. What would be their legitimate defense to an illegal taking of hostages, an illegal movement, invasion, not of 67 lands, but in some cases of lands Israel has under the UN Charter 47-48, right? Some of the lands they invaded were 47-48 lands. So what would be the legitimate defense, and what place would there be for military action? What would you accept as Israel's response? And I say that as a historian of international affairs who knows quite well that any nation, whether we're talking India, the United States, China, Egypt, if attacked in the way that Israel was on October 7th, whether provoked or not, would have responded with military force. I can't think of one that wouldn't have. So what would have been, within your understanding of international law as the expert, what would be the legitimate and acceptable form of Israeli military response?
Sure. Just a few things, though, that you brought up, and I'm going to answer your question, I promise. I like your questions. You said, you tried to compare that you could cite standing Hamas officials versus the Israelis that I cited. I cited Yoav Galan, the standing defense minister, who is responsible for all the Israeli military. I cited the Israeli president. And I can also cite to you Netanyahu and others who have direct command and control politically and militarily. So just not to confuse the audience who's listening and may have thought I was citing some random people out here.
Right, but as I said, also I have actual Hamas charter documents, and I could cite individuals.
And I was going to get to that. So Hamas charter amended in 2017, specifically Article 16 and 17, amended their charter basically to be clear that their problem is Zionism, which is Jewish settler sovereignty in Palestine. Their problem is not Jewish people. And so let us be clear about what we're talking about and what the charter says. They have also indicated that they were willing to enter into if I can
we could be on the same ground on the facts. But on the facts, you were correcting my facts.
I waited till you finished, didn't I, Jeremy?
Well, yes, but I want to make sure you said a lot of things that I factually disagree. I just want to point out the charter does justify the use of military force against Zionists. It changes it from Jews to Zionists, but it does justify the use of force against Zionists. It doesn't distinguish between combatants and innocent civilians, so it would fall into the same problems. I apologize for cutting you off. I want to make sure you knew that I had read that. I'm sorry.
All right. I'll wait for you, and I hope you wait for me. So let's just make that agreement as we move forward.
You've had so much more time, though, but okay, go ahead.
You invited me. Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to have you. Go ahead.
And so, in regards to that, right, to understand what that means is that Hamas has also agreed to enter, and we see this shift that they make, where they also recognize that they can enter into a two-state agreement, which is faster than the PLO shifted. It took them 10 years. It took the PLO 20. Between 67 and 87. We also see that Hamas is a rational actor when it moves from Syria because it doesn't want to be stuck between supporting or opposing the regime, and so now has a new home in Qatar. We also see that Hamas is influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood as a political party. All of this is to say that it's a rational actor, so much so that we saw Israel actually enter into a holding agreement with Hamas in order to maintain control and security in the Gaza Strip against other opposition, including the rise of ISIS in Gaza. So it was trusted. As to whether the targeting of Zionists, it's still, to be clear, they are targeting a specific ideology. And I would say that they cannot target those civilians. I've already said that, Jeremy. They cannot target those civilians. But they are not targeting Jews. They are concerned with a Zionist settler ideology. And so to say I'm an anti-Zionist, does that make me a supporter of genocide? That would be really, really a stretch to call everybody who is an anti-Zionist. So anyway, just something to think about. But you say, and I said this, by the way, in my presentation, setting aside the international law framework that limits what Israel can do in occupied territory. It can invoke international law, self-defense and international law, but that doesn't mean it can invoke it in the nomenclature of saying self-defense, right? Like that's the difference between negligence in law and negligence as I say it. Yes? So here, and that's why I said, and I stated that if Israel is going to respond, one, the greatest form of security for Israel is lifting the siege and ending the occupation and ending apartheid, period. If it's going to respond to this, it has to respond within the bounds of law. And those bounds of law force it to distinguish between the civilians and the combatants. Let's say that it was trying to do that when it evacuated the north. Why then, in the evacuation of the north, did it target the Palestinians on their safe routes to the south? Why then did it target the hospitals? How else could it have fought this war the way that other colonial powers have fought their wars? Most of them aren't fought legally, which is how most colonial powers are actually defeated because they don't have a moral leg to stand on. They're militarily superior, but they're morally inferior. And so that's what we see happen in Vietnam. That's what we see happen in apartheid South Africa. That's what we see happen across in Mozambique, in Angola, in Cape Verde. This is the future. Most militarily superior forces who are trying to protect colonial holdings lose, not militarily, but they will lose morally. And that's precisely the shift that we see before our very eyes. I also want to add one last thing about this equation, right? Hamas is subjecting itself to the ICC and to the ICJ, has said we are ready to be prosecuted, which is far more than Israel has done. And so I would just, also caution that as much as you want, to create these condemnations that we have on record, Israel has even said the ICC is illegitimate. They've called it anti-Semitic, and they've gone so far as to accuse the ICJ of engaging in blood libel in order to undermine it. I think what Israel is doing by equating its Zionism with Judaism is actually not good for Jewish people anywhere in the world. And then finally on this point, I just want to point out, Israel is overseeing an apartheid regime. As much as it wants to define this as necessary to establish Jewish sovereignty in the land of Palestine, what that it means in practice, and I can go through the legal argumentation for you. I can show you the bifurcation of nationality and citizenship. I can show you how this functions as an extraterritorial right to land, housing, citizenship, right? I'm going to spare you that legal argument. You can invite me back another time, maybe in person, to show you. But apartheid is not legitimate. Apartheid is an illegitimate racial colonial structure that must be dismantled. So if we say, right, we need to think about the future, and the future is if Israel insists on maintaining apartheid, and Israel insists on maintaining a siege and maintaining occupation, it is fomenting and promising a future of more and more violence to come. That is a violent structure. It cannot ensure its security or the security of Israelis in that way, and why I am insisting that there is no military solution here.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my question because I really don't think you answered it, though I appreciate much of what you said. Many of the Israelis who were attacked on October 7th, first of all, many of them, as you know, are critics of the regime and actually would agree with many of your criticisms of it. They were in lands that under the UN resolutions of 47 and 48 actually are lands that Jews are under international law entitled to live in. You might disagree with that. These are not 67 lands. These are based on the 47 settlement and the 48 creation of the state of Israel. Now, you can disagree with that, but under international law, they're living in legally Israeli space. International law, as you know better than I do, you're the expert, not me, on international law. I'm just an international relations scholar. Every state has a right to defend its sovereign territory. The United States does this, whether one agrees with it or not. If someone attacks our territory, all states do. There's not a state that doesn't do this in the world. It's what the basis of sovereignty is. And so it's hard for me to understand why you think Israel should not have taken some military action. And what I'm trying to understand, what I really would like, what I'm honestly struggling with, because I share criticisms that you have articulated and others, that the Israeli military response has been excessive and ineffective. What should they have done? What would have been legitimate? And what would have been recognized as legitimate by those who I think are many of us on this call, who would like to then see some sort of movement toward some kind of peace process, which would address many of the grievances that you've articulated. But of course, there are grievances on the other side as well. Many of my Israeli and Jewish friends have been living with terrorism for a long time. And so we could tell a whole story, a whole history of that. So I want to understand what should have been done, what we should be, to put it in even more stark terms, what would you like the United States to advocate Israel does, recognizing as a sovereign state, it's hard to imagine them saying, no, we're just going to negotiate. And also, by the way, why doesn't Hamas just release the hostages if they're really committed at this point? They're holding women and others. Why don't they release them?
Yeah, I know. Why don't all these people release all the hostages? All these Palestinians, some now 4,000, 6,000 Palestinians, women, children who have been held without charge or trial. I agree with you. They should all be released. Every single one of them. And all the hostages for all the captives.
I don't want to cut you off. I'll come back. I apologize.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But I'm with you. Release them all. Israel is not legitimately holding Palestinians in captivity.
Nor is Hamas.
But Jeremy, we're not debating that, are we? But people are not up in arms and supporting the decimation of Israelis in order to release the Palestinian prisoners. And if they were, frankly, I would be the first one on the front line to say absolutely not. That's not how you're going to release them. So that's the answer to your last question. I want to point out to the audience that that Jews are entitled to live on this land. Jews are entitled to live on this land. You are basically articulating the premise of why Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Beit Salem, and and I forget the last name of, I wouldn't say Yad Vashem, but that's the Holocaust Museum. There's another organization, so I won't say its name, but there are, and the Harvard Human Rights Clinic, as well as several others, including Al-Haq and other Palestinians in the legacy, have described Israel as an apartheid regime. Jews live everywhere. If a Jewish person was born today, if your cousin had a baby, you're basically saying that Jewish baby has a right to sovereignty in Nazareth, where Palestinians have never been removed, in an equation that necessitates the Palestinians in Nazareth to be removed and to be subjugated. You can shake your head, but that's actually what's happening on the ground. So as much as you want to say that this is recognized as sovereign, it's also recognized as apartheid. And apartheid is not only illegitimate, it's illegal, and it's a crime against humanity. So Israel has to redefine its sovereignty. In fact, because of its definition of its sovereignty in that way, as not a state for its citizens, but a state for Jews anywhere they may be in the world, Richard Spencer, a white supremacist in the United States, has exalted Israel as a model for the future of European supremacy. It is why many object to the Modi regime in India, where there is also accusation of attacks and even genocide against Muslims because of Hindutva and the assertion that this is Hindu sovereignty. Sovereignty is not elastic, but is limited and is also subject to these principles. In this case, it is apartheid, which is not legitimate or legal. It is a crime against humanity. And this is where we're at. As to the question, what does Israel do? I actually answered your question. You didn't like my answer. You want me to tell you the military operations that they should engage in that would be legal. I am not. I am a civilian, and I study the laws of war. And I can tell you that Israel could engage in certain activity. If you want to know what is permissible, it's what they would engage in urban warfare. And those armies that have engaged in urban warfare might be able to point out to us, right? But what I'm also telling you is that it won't be as effective as Israel wants it to be, which is why as much military force as they use, they will lose on the moral leisure. And the other thing, if the idea is to eradicate Hamas, I promise you that this military force is not working. Hamas right now, even in its embodiment, is a lot of disaffected youth who have grown up as orphans, who have grown up under siege, under systematic warfare, who are not trained, are not trained for military combat, but at this point understand that they're either going to die a slow death or they're going to die fighting for the possibility of a future for Palestinians. So I need to ask you, Jeremy, to consider if Israel wants to protect Israelis, right? If it wants to protect Israelis, and not just expand Zionist settler sovereignty, that would it not engage now in a move to dismantle apartheid? You mentioned the United States. The United States is also complicit in this war. Tomorrow, the Center for Constitutional Rights, it's filing a petition, is in a hearing in the Northern District in California, charging Blinken, Biden, and Austin with a failure to prevent genocide and complicity in genocide. The United States also, during the height of apartheid South Africa, issued its veto power to protect apartheid and Afrikaner sovereignty in that situation. So what does the U.S. have to say to Israel? Clearly, nothing that I think is going to get us out of this. What I would do is end military aid to Israel. What I would do is engage in boycott of apartheid. What I would do is impose weapons sanctions on Israel. What I would do is make the cost of apartheid so high, settler colonialism and apartheid so high, that Israelis come to the negotiating table in good faith, right? And dismantle this regime, which has no room in this world. I don't want to see apartheid by Israel. I don't want to see apartheid in the United States. I don't want to see it in India or anywhere else. And I wouldn't support military force to protect those who are protesting against it. And I wouldn't engage in the attack on civilians to do so. We don't have a lot of time left. So I do hope you ask me some questions about the ICJ as well.
Maybe. I thought you covered that so well, and I'm not an expert on that. So I want to ask you one more question following where we were, and I appreciate your answer. Thank you. And you've been very forthcoming in your answers, and I really appreciate that. I enjoy talking to you and have very high respect for you, so thank you. So I want to ask you one more question following where we are, and then I want to ask a final question. Sorry, two more. I'll ask the first one. You can answer, and then I want to ask a question that we'd already discussed about where do we go from here. Where I hope we can finish on a positive note. What are some positive ways we can go from here? But the question I want to ask you is this: much of what you're saying is that Israel's claims of defense are undermined, at least in part, by the illegitimacy of its domestic regime. You keep using the word apartheid, which others used to, right? It's you're not the only one who uses that, and you gave other examples of regimes you would put under the apartheid category. And your argument was that this, to some extent, delegitimizes Israel's claims. What would we then say about the way Hamas is governed? Would we say that Hamas is? I mean, last I checked, Hamas has not subjected itself to an election in quite a long time. Last I checked, Hamas is responsible for human rights violations of all kinds as well. I'm not arguing, again, it's a contest of who's worse, but doesn't that also then play upon the way we evaluate Hamas's claims? Doesn't that delegitimize their claims as well? Why are we only delegitimizing the claims of perhaps one unjust regime when we have the same problem next door? The way I see it is one of the problems is not simply perhaps the misbehavior of Israel. We can weight that, but what about the misgovernance of the Palestinian territories? What about the problems in the way Hamas has governed itself? And of course, one can blame the external actors, but it's pretty hard doing the same comparative analysis you've done. Let's compare the regime in Hamas, the Hamas regime since they were elected, to other colonial struggling regimes, and I don't think Hamas stacks up that well in terms of its legitimacy, its claims at home. Again, based on what it's done to stay in power, how it stays in power. How do we judge that regime? Why should we judge it? Why should we see Hamas as a more legitimate regime than the apartheid regime you're identifying Israel as?
I really am at a loss for words, Jeremy. I'm not Hamas's attorney. I wouldn't vote for Hamas. I don't want to see them in power. That's not at issue here. If your problem is just wanting to see Hamas disappear, then I would say allow the Palestinians to engage, give Palestinians hope. The reason that they were elected in 2006 through a parliamentary election was because it was a referendum against the peace process, which was very obviously not a peace process, but an autonomy framework to maintain Palestinians in a trap whereby they are only given incremental privileges in exchange for good native behavior. It was a referendum against PA corruption. In the aftermath of their victory, they were subject to a blockade and a siege and never given the opportunity to govern and to fail. And I would love to see them fail. I would also love to see Fatah fail. Palestinians do not have an adequate leadership, and that's also due to external interference, which has undermined the several attempts at having elections precisely because Palestinians, it doesn't look like Fatah is going to win, regardless of who's going to win. And there's opposition like Al-Mubadara, and there's other political parties that might win. But we are under occupation, Jeremy. Hamas, you can't compare. You want me to condemn Hamas's regime? What regime? Hamas doesn't have an airport. Palestinians don't have an airport. Palestinians do not govern the movement of Israelis. Palestinians do not govern the lives of Israelis. How much calories they intake, where they travel, who they marry, what they can eat, where they can go, how they study, whether they they cannot flatten a university. Israel literally has to give the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, a travel permit in order to leave the country. Israel is the sole sovereign from the river to the sea, which is why we evaluate it. Why don't we? I think I would love to engage in Palestinian civil society. You think my only problem is Hamas or Fatah? I want to also fight for full, robust, democratic rights. I want to fight for a society that invests more in its agriculture than its security sector. I want to fight for a place where I can overcome patriarchy, which is endemic in all societies, including in ours. But it is really, really strange for someone to ask me, why aren't Palestinians doing all this when we don't even have the right to, we're not free. We can't engage in elections. We can't engage in movement. We can't engage in travel. End the apartheid, end settler colonization. Let us then build the future and whatever else we want to do in the future. You know, I really, Jeremy, I encourage you and I encourage the audience. The fixation on Hamas is really missing the mark. It's missing the forest for the trees. It's missing the forest for the trees. Palestinians, Hamas doesn't govern the West Bank. Israel shot to kill my cousin at a checkpoint, shot him 6 times above the waist in 2 seconds on June 26, 2020, because there was a car malfunction on the day of his sister's wedding, traveling between 2 Palestinian cities where there was a checkpoint, between Abu Dis and Bethlehem. They declared him a terrorist. They confiscated his body, which remains held hostage in a freezer at the Greenberg Forensic Institute within Tel Aviv University. We do not even, my family can't even bury him. And he is held hostage. We are all held hostage as Palestinians. And so do not miss the forest of this regime of occupation and settler colonization and apartheid for what we can point at as really bad actors. I can point out a bunch of bad actors. Palestinians don't deserve to be free because they're perfect. They deserve to be free because they're human. Thank you.
I agree with that last statement 100%. All I will say, and then I'll ask my last question, is just as you can point very legitimately to the suffering of your cousin, I think it was, and many others, so can I point to those who right now are suffering at the hands of Hamas. And you can say that Hamas is not all of the Palestinian people, whatever. They have become the face, for better or worse, of the Palestinian movement. That's what my students are talking about. That's what people see. And there is an incumbent obligation, even on those with less power, to take whatever action they can, at least to articulate what should be legitimate principles for their own, even if unfree governance, right? You are not given a pass simply because you are treated unfairly, which I think actually many peoples in the world are, including the Palestinians in many respects. So that's my position. My final question, as I promised, and then it will be my final question. You've been very generous with your time, and I want to be attentive to that. You've said a lot, but you've also been generous with your time, and I appreciate that. So my final question is, and I'm hoping we can come to a positive note and some agreement, or at least some space where there's a lot between us that connects, and I hope there is on this. Where do we want to go in 10 years? My hope is that in 10 years, I'll put it on the table. I'm a two-state guy. I believe that there should be 2 states. I would like to see 2 states. I would like to see a functioning, less right-wing Israeli state, and I would like to see a functioning Palestinian state. It's not for me to say what that state should look like, but I'd like to see one that's representative, that's progressive, all the things you were pointing to before. Is that a vision that you see for 10 years from now? Is that where you would like to see us go, or what would you like to see, and how would you like to see the peoples who are in this region today, Palestinian and Jewish and others, how should they be governed? What would you like to see in 10 years?
I have a vision. That vision has been undermined by what I think is the rise of fascism in Israeli society. I'll end with that. But let me start by saying, I didn't mention my cousin to compare suffering, Jeremy. I mentioned my cousin because sometimes examples are the best teacher, and storytelling is the greatest pedagogical tool to demonstrate that my point of missing the forest for the tree, that there is a structure of domination here. And if you are trying to look at all the bad things, setting all the crimes aside, if Hamas releases all the hostages, this bombardment of the Gaza Strip stops, Palestinians are still subject to apartheid and occupation and siege. The way to end a war, normally people surrender to end a war in order to return to a normal life. The normal life that's been offered to Palestinians is a life of permanent subjugation and slow death. That is why I brought the example of my cousin, not to do a tit for tat, but in order for us to focus on the structural harm that's being caused. I would hardly tell a Black person in the United States who complains of police brutality that white people suffer too, and that they suffer racism, and that Black people had attacked them. I would hardly whittle down a structure of violence and domination to its incidents and its symptoms on that. And as for Hamas, they've already been subject to a siege. They are subject to systematic warfare. They are designated as a terrorist organization in Europe and in the United States. I would like to see, can we do the same for Israel? If your point is to point out that there's some sort of equivalence, let's do the same for Israel. At least Hamas has subjected itself to the jurisdiction of the ICJ and the ICC. Let's subject Israel to a siege. Let's list them as a terrorist state and a rogue state, since they told us they don't care what The Hague says. So I just want to, and I only say that to be, to push back on this fixation on Hamas, and fixation on Hamas for audiences that refuse to zoom out, refuse to consider that in the absence of what's happening right now, this violence continues. That there are no rockets from East Jerusalem, and yet settlers took over the homes of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. That there are no rockets from the West Bank, and yet Palestinians are killed systematically. Even before October 7th, it was the highest rate of killing and death in the West Bank. That there are no rockets from Nazareth and Al-Lid, but Palestinians are arrested for as much as posting on their social media, and cannot marry who they please and come and get citizenship for their spouses if they marry Palestinians. That Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem, it has a problem with Palestinians. So what about the future? And I've said in my book and elsewhere that I do believe in a future that actually overcomes competing sovereignty frameworks. I think sovereignty sets us up where it's a mutually exclusive equation where only one people will survive. And I've insisted that we shift to a framework of belonging, which is infinite, that we can all belong to the land, even if we cannot all be sovereigns on that land. And so I have a radical imagination about the way forward. The two-state solution is just an equation for continued Palestinian dispossession and removal. It doesn't resolve the problem, not just for historical wrongs, but even for ongoing removal that Palestinians endure in the Negev, and throughout Israel within the 1967 49 armistice lines. Israel hasn't declared its borders precisely because it is a settler colonial project that is continuously expanding. In that vision for the future, the return of Palestinian refugees is essential, but not the end. I've described it as the beginning of the Palestinian freedom struggle, that it's not the culmination of it, because I would like Palestinians to offer a future for Israelis that's more optimal than the future Israel is offering them. Israel is offering a dismal future of perpetual violence, of perpetual surveillance, of captivity, of subjugation, of harm, and it's exporting these technologies as well. It's the number 4 exporter of some of these surveillance and military and carceral technologies. What is the future we can offer as Palestinians? I have been saying that, but now watching a lot of Israeli society, across Israeli society, at the border, protesting humanitarian aid trucks, who are mocking Palestinian harm and death, who are on Channel 2 and Channel 12 of Israeli media, basically saying, I cannot sleep at night unless I see homes bombed, right? Children who are singing in choreographed nature about the leveling of Gaza. I'm witnessing fascism. So it's hard for me to imagine, how do I tell people we have to live together and we have to create futures of mutual existence together, where I think the primary harm to Jewish people is white supremacy that excluded them from Europe and led to the Nazi Holocaust. And before that, their exclusion from citizenship and their ghettoization in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe. So I think that our common enemy is white supremacy. Unfortunately, Zionism internalized white supremacy. I would like us to see, and I'm in alliance with so many Jewish people who are in that struggle against white supremacy for our mutual liberation. But within Israel, we have now the problem of a fascist society, and I'm not really sure. I'm going to go back and study how fascism has been defeated in Germany, in Italy, in the United States at some point, so that we know how to defeat it here as well.
It's 9
So I'm
o'clock.
just going to clarify, and I think then Ward's going to come on. Your future, though, I like this idea of belonging. I need to read more of what you've said about it because I like that concept a lot. Is this a concept for you where Jews and Palestinians and others would be living together in one entity, whatever it is, or what would it be? What would happen to, I mean, what would happen to the people who are living in the region now? I mean, what do you envision?
I envision belonging. I want everyone to stay. My vision for humanity is not an exclusive. It's completely inclusive. That tracks with everything I've said from the beginning. It tracks with all my writing. It tracks with my study of racism in the United States and Black Palestinian transnational solidarity. My vision that I just articulated to you is in the book. I want everyone to stay. But I'm asking for those Israelis who are now claiming the mantle of settler sovereign and of masters that they can stay, but they have to relinquish the demand to be masters on these lands. They have to envision a future where we belong. In 2018, the Israeli Knesset passed a nation state law that said that only Jews had sovereignty on these lands. They removed Arabic as a language. This is not just the right-wing government that you're opposed to in Ben Gvir and Itamar Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich or Netanyahu. This is Israeli society that passed this 2018 nation state law. You have to dismantle that law. You have to dismantle apartheid. Everyone can stay as long as we believe that we are equally deserving of life, equally deserving of belonging, equally deserving of dignity, equally deserving of family and protection. And unfortunately, Jeremy, Palestinians have not been the impediment to that. And I encourage you to read Palestinian scholars and Palestinian studies, which is so robust. I'm an editorial committee member of the Journal of Palestinian Studies. You can read about visions for decolonization, which repeat this over and over, the Haifa Declaration of 2017, others who have declared what that future looks like. But we have to pay attention to what Palestinians have said. Even before 48, Palestinians never opposed their Jewish siblings from being there. Jews, Christians, many religions and peoples belong on these lands. And there is room for everybody, but not under this framework of exclusionary sovereignty, which is what Zionism has presented to us and demands. And we are seeing the manifestation of what Zionism demands. It demands genocide rather than actually moving us towards a better future.
There are so many things you said there that I don't actually agree with, in particular on 47, 48. But you know what? There's something you said that I really do agree with, and I want us to close on that because part of having a conversation is seeing where you disagree, which is where we have to have a follow-on conversation. I hope we'll have many in person, and where I have more reading to do. But I also want to emphasize where we agree. And here, just as you're drawing, and I think you are legitimately drawing on a long Palestinian intellectual tradition, I'm going to draw on a long Jewish intellectual tradition, which is a long intellectual tradition of saying that this is land that we as human beings need to share, land that belongs to all of us as human beings. And this is holy land, and not only holy land for one society or another. I mean, the Judaism I practice is not an exclusionary Judaism. It inspires me in all sorts of settings to believe in belonging and sharing the fruits of the earth. Jews are environmentalists, just as Palestinians are environmentalists. So I embrace that. I'm glad. Let me just finish. I want to finish on a positive note and a praising note for you. Let me finish my praise for you.
I praise the Jewish intellectual tradition.
Yeah, we're in agreement, and so and one of the things I would love to see, and actually some of my colleagues who I think are watching this, who know this literature better than I do, particularly on the Arabic side, I think there's such a tradition in Islamic law and in Jewish law, and in Islamic literature and in Jewish literature, where we can see our societies coming together to share the land and to live peacefully together, to belong. So I hope we can have another conversation where we talk more about that, and I hope more than anything else that we can get political leaders in all of our societies to talk in those terms and think in those terms. So thank you for inspiring me.
Thank you. I just want to say about the Jewish intellectual tradition. I think, one of the things that the Jewish intellectual tradition has shown us, and especially in their opposition to Zionism, is that we are all supposed to be a part of cosmopolitan societies. None of them are meant to be exclusive. And part of a Jewish diaspora, that condition, contained in Jewish diaspora, is an example for that. That you can even be a people without the nationhood. The opposition that we have is not religious; it's political. And so my opposition is to Zionism in particular, and I think that that's an impediment to our framework of belonging. But I do encourage all those who share our vision of belonging to also participate in demanding a ceasefire now, to ending this genocide, and then to participating in dismantling apartheid.
I want to end genocide too. Committed by anyone who's committing genocide, I think should be prohibited and condemned. That's my position.
All right.
Ward, I think it's up to you to finish
Okay.
this up.
So what can I say after that? How often do we get to see two people of such goodwill and knowledge and ability talking toe-to-toe about some of the very hardest issues on the whole face of the earth? I'm just so full of gratitude to both of you for hanging in there and having what I thought was an extremely interesting, edifying discourse about some very difficult things. You both did a wonderful job. Jeremy, thank you for your help with this. Professor Ericott, thank you for being our guest, and to both of you for participating so energetically on an evening that I think we all learned a lot from. I know I most certainly did. Thank you both.
What an idiot.